And in this video, we're going to take a look at the first two campaigns that the American Army conducted during the War of 1812. This is a war that came about for a variety of reasons. One of the overarching strategic causes of the war had to do with national sovereignty. The United States was simply not happy with the way in which the British were treating the newly independent nation. There were issues of sovereignty which the United States had been unable to clarify, and issues that the United States wanted to have satisfied peacefully, but were unable to do that, and these were factors that led in the direction of war. Another reason had to do with the way in which individual Americans were being treated, primarily at sea. In the 2 decades following the American Revolution, thousands of American seamen were impressed off of American ships and forced to serve in the Royal Navy. And this was another issue that the Americans were upset over and that the British refused to address to American satisfaction. These were all factors that the Americans wanted clarified and wanted solved. The 1783 Treaty of Paris, ending the Revolutionary War, did not resolve all of the bilateral issues that were outstanding, and the British continued to dispute, as an example, the United States-Canadian border, while maintaining armed garrisons at Oswego, Mackinac, and Niagara, New York. The British also continued trading with and encouraging Indians who attacked American settlers, primarily those who were pushing north of the Ohio River into lands traditionally claimed by Indian tribes. A charismatic Shawnee leader, Tecumseh, began to build an Indian confederation to confront this American expansion. He traveled from Canada to the Gulf Coast, speaking to tribal gatherings and encouraging all of the impacted tribes who feared and resented the pressure from American colonists who were moving west. His brother, known as the Prophet, was a religious leader who worked with Tecumseh to form a pan-tribal confederation that could confront these American pioneers. The Prophet preached the importance of rejecting colonial influence, such as clothing made from textiles, Western-type schooling, and the concept of land ownership. While Tecumseh was supported by the British, his efforts eventually got him killed in a battle when the Americans defeated a detachment of his British allies early in the war. His death also brought an end to any plans for an Indian confederation. His brother, the Prophet, also came to grief when his incantations to make American bullets impotent didn't work. No amount of singing and dancing could reinstate his standing as a shaman who could bend future events to the Indians' advantage, and in fact, he eventually became irrelevant. At the same time, American merchants were in a no-win situation caused by the ongoing war between France and England, the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon's continental system demanding that ships who visited British ports or who submitted to British inspections at sea were automatically enemies of France and subject to capture. British orders in council stipulated that ships from neutral countries, such as the United States, must obtain an English permit to trade with any nation other than England and its colonies. The Royal Navy patrolled the eastern seaboard of the United States from New England to Georgia and caused tempers to flare when American ships were routinely stopped and searched. Over time, a series of emotionally charged incidents led to a deepening sense of national insult, feeding a growing desire to uphold American honor. On 18 June 1812, President James Madison signed into law a declaration of war against the English. Congressional support was not unanimous. The House voted 79 to 49 in favor, and the Senate vote was 19 to 13, reflecting deep regional differences. Politicians known as war hawks in the South and the West wanted to fight, but the people of New England knew that their trade would suffer. The United States entered the war woefully unprepared, but with the stated intention of conquering Canada. Shades of 1775, 1776. I suspect that American leaders looked north to Canada initially because that was simply the closest they were to the British. But in neither the American Revolution nor the War of 1812 did that aggression turn out satisfactorily as far as the United States was concerned. Once war was declared, an overly ambitious four-pronged campaign to accomplish the subjugation of Canada was quickly put into motion, and influential Americans saw Canada as thinly populated and lightly defended, and were sure that Canadians would welcome the American army as liberators. In the words of former President Jefferson, quote, "The acquisition of Canada this year," that'd be 1812, "as far as the neighborhood of Quebec, will be a mere matter of marching north. And it will give us the experience for an attack on Halifax, the next and final expulsion of England from the American continent," end quote. He and others seem to have forgotten that many of those Canadians were Revolution-era refugees from the United States. They were royalists, and they were hostile to the nation that had been their former residence. The first and westernmost attack on Canada was conducted by General William Hull, the governor of Michigan Territory. He used Detroit as his base of operations and crossed into Canada, but soon became concerned about his supply lines and returned to Detroit. Now we'll look at this initial campaign in a little bit greater detail. You may have noticed that in the War of 1812 campaign streamers, there are two white lines, whereas in the Revolutionary War there was a single white line, and I can only suppose that they symbolize the first and the second war that we conducted against the British. At any rate, when General Hull, after a very short approach into Canada, quickly returned to Detroit, he was followed by British General Isaac Brock, who prepared to attack Detroit with 350 soldiers, plus the Indian leader Tecumseh accompanied him with an undetermined number of Indians. Demonstrating and threatening, General Brock successfully bluffed the American commander into surrender in Detroit. The British paroled the 1,600 Ohio militia, but the 582 American Army soldiers became prisoners of war. The American General Hull was subsequently court-martialed for his precipitous surrender, and he was sentenced to be shot for cowardice. And eventually, he was reprieved by President Madison, but both his military and his political careers were over. A militiaman named Nathan Newsom later recorded his thoughts concerning that surrender. Some men who happened not to be convenient when Hull surrendered took their flight through the wilderness in small parties in the utmost despair. Anger and indignation were apparent on every man at the infamous conduct of Hull, who had not only committed treason of the highest degree in militiaman Newsom's estimation, but had also put a blot on the fair character of the American people. Worse befell the soldiers and civilians who were occupying Fort Dearborn near Chicago. On 15 August, they evacuated that stockade, and they were then attacked and overwhelmed by Indians while they were on the road. 38 soldiers, 2 women, and 12 children were killed during the initial attack, and 28 more soldiers, 7 women, and 6 children were taken prisoner. Eventually, some were ransomed, but others died while they were enslaved as Indian captives. Warriors had admired the bravery of Captain William Wells of the American Army. And before burning down the fort and moving back north, they chopped off his head and they ate his heart to absorb his courage, which they admired greatly. The other 3 American attacks, 1 from Niagara and 2 from upstate New York, all fizzled. The first pulled back after a defeat at Queenston Heights. Another entered Canada, but only briefly before turning back, and the third couldn't manage to get across the border. A contributing factor in each case was that some militia refused to campaign outside the United States. In January 1813, American general and future president William Henry Harrison advanced with a force of 3,500 men to recapture Detroit. He occupied Detroit when the British were compelled to relinquish control of Lake Erie, and they were forced by Americans who built a small fleet of fairly modest ships that forced the British to abandon the lake. General Harrison then renewed his campaign, and on 5 October triumphed at the Battle of the Thames, where Tecumseh was killed. But then General Harrison drew his campaign to an end. In October, a separate campaign to capture Montreal entailed 2 American armies. A force of 4,000, commanded by General Wade Hampton, marched north from Lake Champlain, intending to meet another 8,000 men, commanded by General James Wilkinson, who were sailing from Sackett's Harbor in Lake Ontario. Supply problems plagued General Hampton, and his advance came to an end when he was defeated by the British on the 25th of October, 1813. General Wilkinson suffered heavy casualties 17 days later at Chrysler's Farm, some 90 miles short of Montreal, and he also returned to the United States without being able to meet up with the other American force. And thus ends the initial phase of the War of 1812. Military developments in Europe had a almost immediate effect on the way in which both the United States and Britain were able to conduct the War of 1812 in North America. When the European coalition occupied Paris in March 1814, it became clear that Napoleon was defeated, and American leaders expected the British government to redeploy veteran British regiments from Europe to Canada. Eager to win a victory before those British reinforcements could arrive, United States Secretary of War John Armstrong ordered General Jacob Brown, commanding a force of 4,100 men, to invade Canada and attack Kingston, the main British base on Lake Ontario. General Brown was also instructed to conduct a diversion across the Niagara River, which connects Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, to distract the British. General Brown was unable to get the ships that were required to attack Kingston, and so he crossed the Niagara River into Canada near its source on Lake Erie and quickly captured Fort Erie on the 3rd of July. What had been planned as a diversionary attack then became his main attack. On the following morning, the 4th of July, he ordered General Winfield Scott's brigade of 1,377 regulars to advance, and late in the day they encountered British troops in defensive positions along the Chippewa River. After a short exchange of fire, General Scott pulled his troops back to encamp for the night, and to celebrate Independence Day. Early the next morning, the British commander, General Phineas Riall, advanced behind a screen of light infantry and Indians with the intention of retaking Fort Erie and driving the Americans back across the Niagara River and into the United States. General Scott deployed his brigade to meet the British, and as the battle opened, an artillery duel developed until a British ammunition wagon blew up, putting the enemy's guns out of action. Believing that he was facing militia, the British general conducted a head-on attack, and when the Americans stood fast and exchanged volleys, he expressed surprise and supposedly exclaimed, "They're regulars, by God." After a lethal short-range fight lasting about 30 minutes, the British were outflanked and forced to withdraw. General Scott's brigade lost 228 men killed and wounded, while the British suffered over 530 casualties. The battle at the Chippewa River proved to be a great psychological boost for the American Army and also encouraged the rest of the country. For the first time in the war, United States soldiers had demonstrated they could hold their own against well-trained British regulars. Until then, British soldiers had referred to their American counterparts as Cousin Jonathan. Cousin Jonathan was a pejorative describing a country bumpkin who lacked both discipline and skill and who was easily beaten. And Cousin Jonathan had disappeared at the Battle of the Chippewa. Captain John Weeks, a company commander in the 11th Infantry Regiment, later wrote, "On the 5th of July, the enemy made his appearance, and a tremendous battle commenced. My company poured into the enemy what the general styled a sheet of fire, and the day was ours. Our number engaged was about 1,300, and the enemy more than 1,800. We killed and wounded over 500 of them. Our loss in killed and wounded was about 200. It was actually 228, to be precise." General Brown's after-action report credits General Scott's rigorous training program and his cool leadership under fire as key factors in changing British attitudes toward the fighting ability of American soldiers. While General Scott's leadership abilities had been widely recognized previously, his training program provided the foundation for his success on the battlefield. General Scott had used his personal copy of the 1791 Manual of the French Revolutionary Army as his guide, training the troops on a demanding 10-hour-a-day schedule that started at 4:30 in the morning. He standardized drill and maneuver and also enforced what he called the indispensable outworks of subordination. He insisted on salutes and other military courtesies and personally supervised training on a regular basis, often wearing his full dress uniform. General Scott was a harsh disciplinarian. He had several deserters executed, and he cropped the ears, which meant he simply had the top part of the ear scissored off, and he had many branded on the face with a D for deserter. I guess the amount of time gone must have been a factor in whether you got branded, cropped, or shot. Under any circumstance, desertion rates plummeted, although it was said that his troops longed for combat to escape the rigor and the tedium of his training program. Those soldiers would rather engage in a fight than get up and train hard at 4:30 in the morning. The success of his efforts became evident at the Chippewa River when his soldiers refused to budge, exchanging volleys with the British for almost half an hour before the British withdrew. Going beyond training the troops, General Scott also purged his units of lazy and inefficient officers, most of whom were political appointees whose commissions were the result of influence rather than merit. He also set and enforced high standards for camp sanitation and personal cleanliness, reducing illness that had previously diminished the fighting strength of combat units. While known to the troops as Old Fuss and Feathers, the feather had to do with the decorative ostrich feather that he wore in his hat. His success building and leading a professional force drew favorable attention from both military superiors and the Secretary of War. Years later, General Scott wrote in his memoirs, "History has recorded many victories on a much larger scale than that of Chippewa, but only a few have brought a greater change in the feelings of a nation." And thus ended the second campaign that the American Army fought during the War of 1812.